the incentive structures that we experience online aren't necessarily empathy positive, right? We're reinforced with little dopamine hits of likes and retweets for doing what? For like sending out advertisements about how cool our life is, or yelling at somebody who's different from ourselves. Why is that? Well, the incentive structures of the platforms that give us those incentives are themselves not that great, right? Social media companies don't exist to make us more connected or happier. They exist to get us online and keep us online.
After reading your book, I was really curious to know how Canadians ranked on the empathy scale, because I assumed that there was some kind of research out there to say, how countries ranked by empathy. And so I Googled it, and yes, there is a study that exists. I don't know, I mentioned to you when we first spoke that, Canadians are known for being very kind and nice, and polite people. So I really wanted to know, how did we rank? So I did find a study, and I'll just start off by saying Americans ranked number 7 in the world for empathy. Anyone want to guess how Canadians ranked? Somebody said 12th, and you're right. Wow. 12th, which kind of surprised me. I was thinking maybe 1, 2, 3. And so I guess my question for you is, can you tell us a bit more about that study, if you're familiar with it, and is it wrong?
Well, I mean, so it didn't sample all the countries on Earth, right? I think it's only 65 of them or so. So there could be lots of other countries that are just way ahead of the US and Canada that we just don't know about based on that research. That was using a self-report questionnaire. It's the most famous measure of empathy, and it's just a series of statements, things like, and you're asked how well those statements describe you, from 1, not at all, to 5, extremely. So like, we can try it here. You could say, I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. You can think about how well that describes you, 1 to 5. Or, I try to look at everyone's side of a disagreement before I make a decision, right? So that plus 26 other statements like it give you an empathy score from 1 to 5. And basically what these researchers did was take the average score from different countries and rank them. Now, it's really interesting and potentially meaningful. There are issues, right? When you ask someone how empathic they are, they might just tell you what they think you want to hear, or what they want to believe about themselves.
Right.
People who are high in narcissism tend to rate themselves as super empathic, but the people around them might not agree, right? So there are issues with that. But one interesting thing about that same questionnaire is that people have been completing it since 1979. Hundreds of thousands of people. And in 2011, there was a set of researchers who tried to look at what those scores look like over time. So we can look at it across space, and that's what the study you're referring to did. Across time, the news is less good, right? So there's been a steady decline in empathy over the decades, such that the average American, at least in 2009, even if they're scoring at number 7, is less empathic than 75% of Americans just 30 years before, right? So there's a steep decline in how much empathy we at least think we feel, and it's accelerated in the 21st century.
Yeah. Okay, so possibly not all that accurate.
Yeah.
Okay, so you write in the book that most people understand empathy as more or less a feeling, like I feel your pain, but you go on to explain that it's actually more complicated than that. Can you explain what empathy actually is? Because I think there are several words that we use interchangeably to describe empathy, sympathy or compassion. So what is empathy?
Thank you so much for that. That's like such an important starting point for any. I feel like empathy suffers from, I call it an Inigo Montoya problem. Have you ever seen The Princess Bride?
Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think it came out 25 years ago now, but Inigo Montoya says, you keep on using that word, I do not think it means what you think it means.
Right.
And I've heard one thing about studying a topic that's so kind of like intuitive and buzzy, like empathy, is that I've heard like literally hundreds of definitions from people who are totally confident that they're right about what empathy is, and all disagree with each other, right? And part of that is because empathy is more complicated, as you say, right? I mean, it's an umbrella term that refers to a number of different ways we respond to each other's emotions. So I would say, like, imagine that you're having lunch with a friend, and he gets a phone call, and you don't know who's on the other side of the line, but you know what they're saying isn't good because your friend starts to cry, right? So a bunch of things might happen in you. You might feel bad yourself, and maybe even start tearing up. That's what we would call emotional empathy or emotion contagion. You know, that feeling of catching what someone else feels. You might also try to figure out what your friend is feeling and why, and that's what we'd call cognitive empathy. But at least if you're a good friend, you'd also want to help your friend feel better. That motivation to help others is what we call empathic concern or compassion. And so these pieces together sort of interlock to create human empathy.
Okay. You point out in your book that for centuries, scientists and philosophers believed that empathy was a fixed trait. So something that you're either born with or not, and that you didn't have the ability to change that. You lay out the case that empathy is not a fixed trait, but rather a skill that we can strengthen, much like we can strengthen our bodies through exercise. Can you speak to that a bit more? Why did we have that belief system for so long?
I mean, people have had fixed belief systems about ourselves in a number of different ways. We've thought that intelligence is fixed. We've thought that our character, our moral character, is fixed. We've thought that our emotional abilities and our personalities are fixed. Part of that is because change is slow, right? I mean, we thought that the Earth stood still before we knew about tectonic plates, and the person who came up with that theory was ridiculed because you can't see the world moving under your feet, and you can't feel yourself changing either. So it feels as though, hey, I'm the same person I was 10 years ago, and I'll probably be the same person in 10 years. Another reason that I think people have been so stubborn in their view of human nature as fixed is because it's advantageous to people who are in power, right? You can use a fixed view of human nature to legitimize hierarchies between different groups of people by saying, well, those people are subordinated to us because they're inferior and always will be. It's a genetic thing, right? So when you allow for malleability, you allow for mobility as well. And some people maybe don't want that. I mean, phrenology is an example of that.
Right. You write about the influence of our parents, the influence that they have on our level of empathy at a very young age. You talk about a 1-year-old child whose parents express high levels of empathy, show greater concern for strangers as 2-year-olds, and are more able to tune into others' emotions as 4-year-olds, and so on. So how does our upbringing or life circumstance influence our level of empathy?
Yeah, hugely. And this is why I believe it can be viewed usefully as a skill, right? Because there is a genetic component to empathy, but our experiences matter enormously, and especially early in life. So, the level of empathy that your parents express matters.
Right.
But you might be thinking, wait a minute, but your parents also share your genes. So maybe if your parents are really empathic, you are too, but that's just because you're genetically coded to be more empathic.
Right.
But it turns out that this is also true of children in adoptive families, right? So if you're adopted into a family where your adoptive parents are highly empathic, you will develop greater empathy, which suggests that it's not merely genetic, but really about the experience that you have in your home.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember as a kid watching my mom experience the news. Like when she saw something negative happening on the news, and just her reaction to it. And it really had an impact on me, just seeing how she expressed concern for whatever it was that was happening. I want to ask you about spirituality and religion. Is there any evidence that suggests that religious or spiritual people are more empathetic?
Oh, that's a really good question. And there's not a lot of data on this. Any spiritual tradition is like such a broad diaspora of people with really different belief systems within it. I mean, I think that there's a lot of work from people like Azim Sharif, the great psychologist who studies religion, that suggests that religion is sort of a sort of social contract that allows us to create structures around things like empathy and mutual aid and care for each other, which would suggest that there should be a connection between spirituality and empathy. But again, there's not as much research as there should be.
Okay. In chapter 3, you tell the story of a young man from Vancouver. You use stories, Canadian stories, quite a few times in the book.
I'm a fan of this great nation.
Yeah. A young man from Vancouver, Tony, his name is Tony, a former member of the White Aryan Resistance, and his journey out of hatred. You write that hatred buries empathy, but it does not kill it. Can you talk more about how someone involved in such a hateful organization can be rehabilitated?
Yeah, so Tony is a really special person who had a really troubled childhood and felt very isolated and angry as a kid. And, you know, he found community and acceptance among people who, you know, hated folks who were different from them. And I think that's one thing that, you know, he takes full responsibility for all of his actions. But I think that it's important to realize that one of the threads that connects people in all sorts of different hate groups is, you know, a history of neglect and abuse as children, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of these people, you know, there's that old phrase, hurt people, right? And Tony was certainly a hurt person. And he sort of encased himself in this hateful persona that allowed him to feel strong and allowed him to feel like he could survive. And an interesting thing for him is that the way that he was extracted from that life was that he became friends with somebody who he didn't know at the time was Jewish, this guy named Dov Baron. And he was talking with Dov once, and it came out that Dov was Jewish, and Tony decided to admit to his past anti-Semitic behavior. And he fully expected Dov to reject him or condemn him. He felt that that's what he deserved. And I think underlying his hatred was this sense of self-hatred, really. Right. But Dov instead showed him compassion. You know, he said, that's what you did, but it's not who you are. You're better than that. I see you.
Right.
And just that shocking acknowledgement of his own humanity kind of cracked Tony open and made him realize that he was a worthwhile person without having to act in this way, and set him on a path to reform.
Okay. Well, that brings to mind another term that I was introduced to from reading your book, the idea of contact theory. You reference a psychologist, Gordon Allport's book, The Nature of Prejudice. And in his book, he reasons that bigotry boils down to a lack of acquaintance. So we don't interact with people who are like or different than us enough, and that only if we did, you know, that would sort of help heal some of the issues that we have with, you know, this disconnect with people. Do you believe that that theory is actually correct? Is it really that simple that all we have to do is connect with other people that are not like us?
It does sound a little bit like a recipe for a souffle that just has one ingredient in it, doesn't it? It's like, really? A souffle with one ingredient? Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I think that there is, though, on the other hand, a lot of evidence that as we become more divided and less civil as a society, we are becoming just extremely incurious about each other, right? I mean, people see others who are different from them and are really quick to reduce that other individual to one part of their identity, whether it's political or racial or ideological or whatever. And there's a lot of assumptions that we make. So my friend Adam Waits has shown, for instance, in the US, both Democrats and Republicans are fully confident that they are driven by love of country, but that the other side is driven by hatred of country, which obviously they can't both be right, but they both believe what they're saying. I think there's a sense, again, I'll just speak about the US, where people just assume the worst about each other. And I do think that those types of stereotypes just can't survive person-to-person contact, because no person can be reduced to one part of their identity.
Yeah. And when I read the title of your book, I immediately thought of Donald Trump. And because he's somewhat become the poster child for someone that lacks empathy. But is this giving him too much credit or blame? And I say that because I think about the US population, over 300 million people. And a recent poll I saw had his approval rating at 40%. And that's not to say that all people that approve of Donald Trump are racist or bigots or lack empathy, whatever. But that's a lot of people. That's over 100 million people.
Yeah, it's tough out there. It's down there. So a little bit of behind-the-scenes stuff. When I started this book, it wasn't called The War for Kindness. It was just called Choosing Empathy. Pretty anodyne, oh, this is a book that maybe would be helpful to people, more as individuals. I started in 2015, and then sort of was writing it and saw kind of the world slowly catching fire, I guess, would be one way of putting it. I realized that, wow, in a context I hate the phrase Donald Trump's America, but in the context of a country whose current president is so inflammatory to our public rhetoric, empathy is a radical choice, right? I think that empathy is a choice to push back against something and to fight against trends that are taking our culture over.
Just to change gears a bit, you talk about caring too much in Chapter 5. And you start off Chapter 5 on a very personal note when you write about the birth of your daughter and the experience you had at the hospital with her, you and your wife, with her caregivers. You say few are at greater risk of overdosing on empathy than caring professionals, so doctors, social workers, therapists, teachers, and others who work with people in need. Can you tell us more about your experience being on the receiving end, one of so much empathy, because that's what you were talking about, and also, is it possible to care too much?
Yeah, thanks for asking. This is a super important topic, because sometimes I think people take a book that's about building empathy and think that the message is the world would be better if we were all just our empathy was turned up to 11 all the time. But that world would be a disaster, right? Imagine feeling everybody's pain and trying to walk one block in downtown Toronto. You'd fall apart, right? And likewise, I don't want my therapist being as upset as I don't want him saying your life really is bad. Oh no, you're supposed to be helping me, right? Sometimes feeling other people's pain isn't useful for helping them, and it's certainly not useful for the person feeling it. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'll try not to go too long here, but our first daughter, Alma, she had a traumatic birth and had a stroke when she was born, and obviously it was a really difficult time for my family and I, but one of the things that got us through it was the just immense care that was provided to us by the physicians and nurses and social workers and staff and administrators at her NICU. They were like family to us in this really difficult, the most difficult moment in our life. And at the time, I was just so consumed by what we were going through. I was just grateful for them. But we were there for weeks, and at some point, I was kind of are these people, how are they okay? How are they doing this? These empathic super. I was do you have families? And yeah, we have families. And it's how do you do that? At this NICU, they specialize in extremely premature babies. They lose a baby every week, and how do you go to that job, then come home and take care of your kids, and then come back and do it again? So I went back there and shadowed them for a week, and the answer is not easily, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these people were suffering deeply, from burnout, what we call sometimes compassion fatigue. They had PTSD from seeing other people's struggles. A lot of them struggled with their own mental health issues, alcoholism, physical health issues. And now I'm working with them, right? So we're creating a program because it turns out that, right, working with empathy, being an effective empathizer, again, is not about empathizing as much as you can all the time. It's about figuring out how much you want to empathize and how you want to empathize in a given moment. Earlier you asked, what is empathy? And we were talking about the different pieces of it, right? There's a big and important distinction here between taking on other people's feelings, feeling as they do, which is emotional empathy, and then empathic concern, feeling for someone and wanting them to feel better, but without taking on their pain. The first of those not very sustainable in really high-impact contexts.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, more sustainable. So I'm working now with my friend Eve Ekman, who's a sort of Buddhist practitioner, and we're using contemplative practice, because it turns out there's all sorts of, like, many thousands of years old meditation practices that are oriented specifically towards helping people tune between emotional empathy and compassion. And so we're now working with the NICU to try to train the staff there in how to sort of tune themselves towards a slightly more distanced form of empathy where they can be there for families like us, but not lose themselves in the process.
Yeah, my sister is a nurse, and she's been in nursing for over 20 years, and I always used to say to her, I don't know how you do this, because she worked in palliative care for many years, so just day after day, being around people that are near the end of their life. So I can understand that, that it's just sort of taking on those emotions. If any nurses out there, hats off to you.
Yes, thank you.
I want to talk about climate change. Not something you think about when you think about a book on empathy, but I thought it was interesting, some of the things that you mentioned. Last month, millions of people worldwide participated in a global strike calling for climate justice to be an ethical obligation and not just an environmental issue. In an interview, 16-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg said that the symbolism of this school strike is, since you adults don't give a damn about my future, I won't either. In your book, you touch on how lack of empathy has an impact to our action or inaction on climate change. And you say we are doing a woefully inadequate job of protecting our future generations, in part because it's so difficult to imagine them. I thought that was a really striking statement. And so the question is, how do we widen our circle of caring?
That's
for people that we can't even imagine, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? I mean, that's the question that people in my field are most interested in now, and it's an urgent one, right? I mean, there's something that's problematic about empathy. It's this really powerful engine for kindness, cooperation, and for helping others, but it's naturally tends to be a little bit narrow. I mean, there's something that we call the identifiable victim effect, right? It's easier, I guess that's quote that's sometimes attributed to Stalin, that one death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is a statistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's lots of evidence that people actually find it easier to empathize with one person whose picture they can see, whose voice they can hear, and they find it more difficult to empathize with lots of people at a time, even though lots of people, by definition, need our help more than any one of them, right? So that can make our caring kind of backwards. And as you say, that's exacerbated when we try to think about the future and people who don't even exist yet. The good news, I think, is that people are the most imaginative species on the planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And empathy is, in a way, the combination of our emotional instincts with our capacity to imagine others, right? So one example of this is, fiction, which drives a massive amount of empathy even towards real people who are different from ourselves. But I mean, I think that there are ways that we can use that same imaginative power to think about the future. So there are now some nonprofits that are using these exercises where people write about what will a day be like for your great-great-grandchild, Or, I mean, I think, to your point, Thunberg herself and the whole climate, sort of this climate movement is being led by who? By children.
By children, yeah.
Representatives of future generations. And these are people who we can see and who we care enormously about, who are telling us the world that you're leaving behind for us is not a healthy one.
Yeah. Let's talk about social media. What impact, negative or positive, has technology, specifically social media, had on empathy?
It's complicated. I mean, social media could be our species' greatest empathic opportunity of all time, right? It should be this, like if you read Wired from 2010, man, I mean, people were really ecstatic about this global community we were all supposed to build together. And it hasn't really shaken out that way, has it? I mean, it doesn't feel that way.
It doesn't feel that way, no.
And I think part of it is because the incentive structures that we experience online aren't necessarily empathy positive, right? We're reinforced with little dopamine hits of likes and retweets for doing what? For like sending out advertisements about how cool our life is, or yelling at somebody who's different from ourselves. Why is that? Well, the incentive structures of the platforms that give us those incentives are themselves not that great, right? Social media companies don't exist to make us more connected or happier. They exist to get us online and keep us online, so that they can give dividends to their shareholders, and that's bad, right? That's created this toxic environment. But that's not to say. I mean, people always ask me like, if we just got rid of our phones, would we be more empathic? And I'd say there is evidence that if you take people's phones away for a week, they get better at understanding other people's emotions. But I don't think it has to be that way. Our phones could have a lot of empathy inside them, right? There's other people, like people say, kids these days, they look at their phone all the time. On the other end of that phone are other people who they can communicate with, right? The question is, what type of communication are we generating online? What type of structures are we creating that allow people to connect? And right now, the answer is we're not building very good structures, but we could.
Right. Well, you talk about a community called the Cocoa community and how that helped you.
Yeah.
And also, I think we need to recognize that we have a lot of power to curate our experience online. That's one of the things that I personally have really been focused on, and making sure that what I'm looking at and what is in my feeds, I have control over that. I think of a friend that when she posts something that is, or she's looking for people's feedback, she actually puts a disclaimer in her Facebook post just to say, like, let's all be respectful of each other's differences of opinion. So I think it's just really learning that we have the power to curate that kind of that content, and what we experience online is really important too.
I love that idea. Yeah, I mean, I think that the information that we consume is like the food that we eat. It affects our health for better and for worse. And I feel like a lot of the information, I'll just speak for myself, man. I mean, you spend an hour on Twitter and you just feel like the world is on fire and everyone's terrible, and it's just, it makes you feel hopeless. And I think sometimes 10% of people on Twitter produce 80% of tweets, and those people are more politically extreme than the majority. But it's easy to confuse them for the majority and feel like, wow, people are just really extreme. We might be getting a warped, not just a pessimistic sense of human nature from our time online. We might be getting an inaccurate one, and that's another problem.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting stat, 10%.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about virtual reality? You write about how virtual reality is being used to help people care more. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so people have thought about virtual reality as a kind of empathy machine, because you can basically step into the body of somebody who's different from you. And my friend and colleague Jeremy Bailenson has done a lot of this work where he actually has people sort of physically embody somebody who's a different gender or race than themselves, or age. Or he can even create virtual reality experiences where, for instance, you experience what it's like to be colorblind. And he shows that in all those cases, that first-person perspective of what it's like to be someone else, someone who's different from you, builds sort of, or reduces stereotypes about that group of people.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk about actually the end of the book. I mentioned to you we spoke on the phone that at the back of the book there is a listing of claims, like a rating of the things that were discussed in the book. And can you describe that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so. Science is a living thing, right? I mean, I think we tend to think of it as just a set of facts that someone has hammered into a stone tablet somewhere, but it changes, And I mean, we used to think the Earth was flat, then we thought it was spherical, but then the sun went around it. Then we thought it was spherical and going around the sun, but it didn't move at all. That now we know about. Yeah, so our knowledge evolves, and our understanding of everything does too. In psychology, there's been a lot of, and that's my home field. There's been a lot of studies that people thought were real, that then other psychologists tried to, I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but other psychologists then try to rerun those studies, and they don't find the thing that the original researchers found. It's called the replication crisis, or whatever you want to call it. And it's, for some people, it's caused them to lose faith in research as a whole or science as a whole, which is really useful for some people who don't want us to listen to any science, right? My thing is that science is moving and should move, but I want readers of my book, at least I hope other people do this too, to be able to go deeper. You know, some of the things that I write about are based on decades of evidence, and some are based on like stuff that had come out 1 week before I wrote about it. And I don't know for sure, well, when other people try and do that work, will they find the exact same thing? I don't know. I don't want that to stop me from writing about it because it's really exciting and brand new. But one should be able to understand when what they're reading is brand new and still needs to be vetted further versus when scientists are super confident about it.
Yeah, I thought it was really helpful. When I first started reading the book, I looked at the back and I thought, okay, I'll just skip these pages. But then by the time I finished reading it, I wanted to know more. So I did actually go through and read all of those claims and how you rank them.
Oh, wow, even my mom didn't read that section. That's amazing.
You teach a course on kindness. Can you tell us about that course? Like, what does the curriculum look like?
It's so fun. It's called Becoming Kinder. It's a tiny class for freshmen. So it's 16 brand new adults who just got to college. And we talk about the science of empathy and kindness. We talk about why it's hard to empathize, and we share stories about why it's hard for us sometimes. And then each weekend, I give them an assignment to try to expand themselves in some way, right? So like we have an assignment called Disagreeing Better, where you find somebody who you disagree with, often, though not always politically, and try to interview them. Instead of like just sort of taking shots at their opinion, try to ask where their opinion came from. So we had a lot of people in the class found their uncles who are like Facebook happy uncles and sort of talked with them. You know, there was a lot of, they were scared. They were scared to do these assignments. In other assignments, you take a time that you're stressed out and you don't feel like you have energy for anyone else and help someone anyways. And the students were often nervous about doing these assignments and pretty much always happily surprised with how they turned out, right? So students feel like, gosh, I'm stressed. I'm at Stanford. There's too many assignments. I'm going to fail. I'm not as smart as everyone here. I don't have time to help somebody. But what they find, and is consistent with lots of research, is that when they help other people, they actually are less stressed out and happier themselves and feel more capable. Likewise, they think, oh God, this conversation is going to be a nightmare and I'm going to be angry and sad. But they find, wow, I might not agree with this person, but I feel like we have some common understanding and I have a sort of broader sense of the type of person I can connect with, right? So it was really fun. And I have to say, again, another thing that I hear a lot about, so there's been this decline in empathy over time. People confuse that with a decline in empathy over generations. So they think that, okay, if people are becoming less empathic, that means that Gen Z is like, all they want to do is take selfies or something, right? And people tell me that a lot. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case at all, right? I mean, younger people have had a different experience growing up. We've subjected them to social media in different ways. And yeah, that might have changed them, but in no way does that mean that their generation is lost or at fault for any differences between them and us. And these students were, absolutely inspirational. And I feel like if they at all resemble or represent who's coming up, or if Greta Thunberg and her ilk do,
I was just going to say, think about that example.
Then we actually might maybe have a fighting chance.
I want to ask you about your kindness challenge. I went to your website and you posted a series of videos, kindness challenge videos. What was your goal there, and how did you come up with those challenges?
Well, they're from the class, actually, right? So, I went from the book to thinking about, well, let me try to come up with a practical way of seeing if I can teach this to people. And then from that, the students, they wanted to be able to share the challenges with their friends and family. So they said, can you post these? And I did. I just posted a few of them. Did you try any of them by any chance?
Well, one of the ones was talking about being kinder to yourself,
yes,
and showing yourself forgiveness and empathy. And I thought that was a really good first starting point to point out that you have to show yourself that the same level of empathy that you are showing others and the same kindness that you are showing others.
One of the things that stops us from connecting with other people is when we are too sort of disrupted ourselves. That's what happened to Tony, right? He was so lost in himself, that he sort of lost his ability to see other people's humanity. I have to tell you, that challenge was the hardest to be kind to yourself was the hardest for my students. They thought, hey, it's clearly a morally good thing to do for me to try to stretch my kindness for other people, but being kind to themselves felt self-indulgent or selfish. They felt like, well, I'm privileged. I don't deserve to have kindness, and that's a stumbling block for a lot of people, and it's one for me too. I have to say, it's sometimes the hardest person to like. Sometimes is yourself.
Yeah, it's true. We have 5 minutes left before we get to a Q&A. One last question: what difference can one person make, and how do you keep from becoming discouraged when it feels like we are taking a turn for the worst?
So it's tough. I mean, it can be discouraging. I mean, God knows I'm super discouraged like 70% of the time, But since the book came out, I've received so many emails, like hundreds of emails from people who say, I want the type of world that you write about in the book, but I'm alone, right? And I'm always thinking, well, but you should read these other people's emails because you're not alone. Like, you're all writing to me, like you should just, and I wonder, again, we talked about these like extreme voices on Twitter, for instance, just run our public discourse until we believe that that's who everybody is. And we see ourselves as alone, and we ask ourselves, what can one person do in the face of all of this? But we're not just one person. I mean, each one of us is one person, but together we're many people, and I think that there might be more of us than we realize, right? And this is one of the things that I try to tell leaders of any organization or like family or any space, right? That one of the ways to foster empathy and kindness is to make it loud, right? To make it take up more room, to make it visible, and to lift it up. Because I think that, if one person can't do very much, but there are a lot of us, and I'm not sure how many of us there are, but I hope that we're the majority, and I think that we might be.
I agree with you. I think we are. We just need to start hearing it more, I think.